All right. Here come the folks. Dude, super excited to have you on today. I think this is going to be a really exciting one for folks that want to dive a little bit deeper into some of the more technical goings-ons within the NIL world, and we're super excited to have Mitt Winter here with us today. Can't thank you enough for joining us, man.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, how is life in the world of NIL these days?
It's busy right now.
Yeah,
There's a few things going on.
yeah,
Uh,
just a couple.
yeah.
Um, what's been taking up the majority of your time this week?
Um, well, a lot of different stuff. Um, work this week has been a lot of working with various businesses that are doing different things in the NIL world. A lot of that kind of in partnership with universities. Um, Not necessarily specifically related to the house settlement. Some of it's
Sure.
sort of related to that, but then just other business related things with the way things are kind of moving with NIL and kind of like the changing world, kind of helping people with that stuff.
Awesome. For those of you that don't know, Mitt is an attorney been focused on NIL. Really, probably one of the most leading thought kind of provokers and leading voices within the space. I've gotten to know you, Mitt, kind of over the past couple of years, just being on panels together, floating around the same conferences and in the same rooms. But yeah, man, we're super excited to have you. And you brought up the house settlement. It feels like that's maybe been talked to death a
There's a
bit
lot
at
to
this
talk
point. Like,
about there,
yeah, I
though.
mean, we've had a couple of folks. We had Christy on. We've talked to a handful of different groups about how the house settlement is coming in, how it's going to affect people, how it's going to you know really change the landscape. You know, I follow you. I've seen a lot of the stuff that you do. You seem to be a little bit more, on the side of, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth and obviously, speak for yourself here, but it feels like you're more on the side of like, hey, this is probably not going to solve all of the world's problems as it's being presented by Charlie Baker and his friends at the conferences and within the NCAA. Can you maybe help us to just like understand some of the things that like the rhetoric that we hear from some of those folks and maybe what you think the more realistic kind of outcomes are for some of those pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think even the NCAA and the conferences know that this settlement agreement on its own is not going to solve every legal and practical issue that college sports has, and it's not likely going to be the final model. I mean,
Sure.
if you read through all of the various documents related to the House settlement, it's pretty clear that they understand that they're still going to need some help from Congress to really, number one, implement some of the stuff in the settlement, and then number two, to really keep it in effect for as long as they hope to keep it in effect. There are still ways that new college athletes coming into the system that are not class members in the House case, every year they're going to be able to object to the settlement's terms.
Mm.
So who knows what's going to happen there? That could present some issues with the settlement, assuming it does get approved by the judge, because there's still, still caps athlete compensation. So there's still some
Sure.
antitrust issues there. You still have the employment issue lingering out there, which the House settlement does not address. So, like the Johnson case and the NLRB stuff that's out there, that's going to keep on proceeding. And in the House settlement, it does talk about if employment happens, we can reopen the settlement and figure things out
Sure.
at that point if we need to. So those are a couple of the big issues that are still out there, and so that's why you still see the NCAA and the conferences, meeting and talking with Congress, still trying to get an antitrust exemption, still trying to get a law that says college athletes cannot be employees. So we'll have to see where all of that stuff goes, but there's still going to be lots of unsettled issues and moving parts with college athletics over the next few years. And,
Sure.
even just with the terms of the House settlement itself, there's still a lot of uncertainty there with things like Title IX
Yeah.
is a huge unknown right now, how that's going to play into everything. So
Yeah.
still lots of legal issues that are going to have to be solved with the House settlement if it is approved.
You brought up the congressional intervention to I think help the NCAA. It's certainly what I think Charlie's been kind of aiming for from the outset. In the election cycle, it probably feels less and less likely. Like, I mean, do you see a world in which that takes place in the next even 12 months, or is it still a pretty tough putt for the NCAA to actually go to Congress and get them to put something to a vote that would get them the kind of exemptions that they're looking for?
Yeah, I personally think it's going to be really hard to get a federal law passed that gives the NCAA an antitrust exemption or that says college athletes cannot be employees. Um, it's hard to say, if Trump wins and Republicans win the
Yeah,
House and Senate, maybe that would be more helpful in getting those things passed, but it's still a wild card, in my opinion. I just think there aren't very many industries that get antitrust exemptions, number one. And there aren't a whole lot of industries, I don't know if any, ever in the history of the United States that have gotten a law passed that says these people cannot be employees. So I just think from a practical perspective, it's going to be hard to convince whoever's in power in the federal government to pass those types of laws. But I will say that reaching the House settlement probably, assuming it does get approved by the judge, probably will help a little bit there because
sure.
it gives them something to take to Congress and say, hey,
We're taking
we're now
legitimate
we're
steps.
now sharing some revenue with the athletes.
Right,
We're being more
right,
athlete friendly. So please help us out here with these laws that we want.
right. And then the only other one to me that has kind of direct employment implications that's happening now is kind of what's going on Dartmouth's campus. I don't know if how closely you've been following that, or if you have any thoughts on whether or not that, you know, is a step forward for athlete rights and employment, or if it's, kind of more localized to a single group at this point.
Yeah. So most people probably know that the NLRB said, yes, the Dartmouth men's basketball players are employees. After that, the basketball team voted to unionize. So they now have a union.
Yeah,
Dartmouth has refused to bargain with them, which when you have a union, you're supposed to bargain with them in good faith on the terms of their employment. Dartmouth has refused to do that and has filed an appeal with the NLRB to get that decision overturned. The men's basketball team's union, as of I think last week, then filed an unfair labor practice charge saying, Dartmouth, you're not agreeing to bargain with us like you're supposed to because we are now a union. So that's going to take a while to go through the court system. It'll eventually up in the federal court system and maybe go all the way to the Supreme Court. So anything final there will probably be a few years off still. And we haven't seen, I think a lot of people were expecting that when the NLRB said that the men's basketball players are employees, that we'd see a lot of other athletes, especially at private schools like Dartmouth, try and do the same thing.
sure.
Yeah, we haven't seen any of that yet. There is another NLRB proceeding pending out in LA related to USC men's and women's basketball players and football players, basically
Sure.
making the same arguments as a Dartmouth case that those athletes on those teams are employees of their school, but also Pac-12, which doesn't really exist anymore, and the NCAA. I think the initial decision from the NLRB will probably turn out the same way as the Dartmouth one, and they'll say they are employees, at least of their school. I don't know
Sure.
what to say with respect to the NCAA. But again, that's going to, it'll be
And
appealed through the court system. It'll still be years off.
what is the big deal with having student athletes being employees? Like, why does the NCAA need this special exemption? What is it if athletes become employees that this whole thing, takes on a different life.
Yeah, I think really two things. Number one, I think they're really concerned with the cost if they have to actually, pay them
Sure.
a wage for their work. Um, if you're having to do that for every college athlete or even like a large subset of college athletes, I think they're afraid of how
Yeah.
much it's going to cost, and you have like workers'
Sure.
comp issues and things like that. And also, they're also worried that it's not going to be a limited determination that, let's say, like FBS football players or P4 football players and basketball players are employees. They're worried it's going to be every college athlete at every
Sure.
level. And
Right.
so, they're saying D3 can't handle that. Their college
Right.
sports are going to go away at certain levels if that happens. And then I
Yeah.
think just number two, it's just fear of the unknown and fear of the difference from the way college athletics has operated for such a long time. College athletes haven't been employees, and so it's hard for people to get their mind around a world where they might be employees and
Yeah.
things that would be different there. So I think it's just a little bit fear of the unknown as well.
It's funny. I think it's probably more that than anything at this point. Like, I think what we're finding out is people can largely kind of figure out the cost problem. Like there's more and more money coming in from more and more sources, and it's forcing folks to be a little bit more creative in terms of how they go out there and you know monetize the assets that they have or more efficiently operate their organizations. But
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like employment is just the next step. It's like we can't do NIL, that'll ruin college athletics. We do NIL. Like we can't have pay for play, that'll ruin. We're doing pay for. It's like we
Yeah.
can't rev share with the athletes. We're gonna. It's like it's just the next step.
Yeah.
And if you're like, oh God, like what's gonna happen? It's all gonna be fine. Like,
Yeah.
well, Alabama will still play Georgia. Like Michigan will still play Ohio State. Like it will certainly, I think, affect, I think, the longer tail a little bit more. And there's going to probably have to be some reshuffling and stuff. But yeah,
Yeah.
it is interesting that fear piece, I think is understated more often than not when we have these kind of discussions of just like, oh, we just don't know. And so we
Right.
can't do it.
Yeah. If I had to bet, I would bet within 5 years that some college athletes are going to be employees.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you'd be closer to right than wrong.
Yeah.
I guess kind of tangential to that point, and maybe back to the House settlement for a moment. Collective bargaining. I know that you're an advisor to AO and obviously to many organizations across the entire industry, but hey, the athlete's voice in these kinds of decisions and these kind of in these rooms that are setting the course for kind of the next stage of college athletics. Where is the athlete's voice captured in here, and how, in your mind, does it need to be kind of brought into the fold more if it's not loud enough already?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you ask the NCAA, they would say the SAC, student athlete
Sure.
advisory committee, has a voice in all this stuff. But I think it's hard to really say that with validity because it's still part of the NCAA. It's not something separate from
Sure.
the NCAA. And then with the House settlement itself, it was brought, plaintiffs are college athletes. So some people will say there that, this is a class action lawsuit brought on behalf of all of these college athletes, and their attorneys were advocating for them. And so they reached the settlement, and athletes have signed off
Sure.
on it. So they're involved there. But I do think for college athletics to finally reach a place of, peace and certainty, that collective bargaining is really the answer, because right now college athletics issue is they have tons of antitrust law problems. You've seen, I don't know, for more than the past 10 years, there have been lots of lawsuits brought against them, and they're losing them all now.
Yeah.
Courts have really turned against them on that.
Were they ever winning?
Yeah, they were for a long time, actually.
Were they?
It's been, the last, the last 10,
my history of like NCAA,
yeah,
court proceedings is rather limited to the past like 3 or 4 years, but
yeah.
it
There were
feels
a
like
few
they never
lost.
win anything.
There were a few they lost, but they were not related to college athlete compensation. Like you've seen kind of starting with the O'Bannon case and flowing through that, the courts have really changed their viewpoint on how antitrust law applies to rules that limit college athlete compensation. And so they're starting to lose all of those cases. And so to really get to, and not even that, but also the player movement issue, they lost that earlier this year in the battle case. So now you have unlimited player movement, and you have, at least right now, unlimited player compensation. And so if you really want to create rules around especially those two things, which I think are the things that are really vexing like coaches and administrators, especially, to do those things, you need to have them collectively bargained with athletes and another entity, whether that's a school or some other entity that's operating a team, because if rules like that are collectively bargained, they become immune from antitrust law. So that's why in pro sports you can have salary caps,
Right.
You have the draft, all kinds of different
Yeah.
rules that have minimum salaries,
Free agency,
yeah, free agency,
like
all that stuff. They have that because it was collectively bargained, so they've agreed, and it's immune from antitrust law at that point. Otherwise, those type of things do violate antitrust law, which is
right.
seen college
That, I mean, that to me
athletics.
seems to be the part that is going to just the tail will be so long on it, it will never end. That until you have the athletes at the table and can agree to some type of collaborative outcome, you're just going to have one after another kind of walk in and out of court, and there's going to be a battle to fight every step of this.
Right. And right now, to be able to actually truly collectively bargain, you have to be employees. So there's been talk that maybe we can get Congress to pass some sort of law that has a system that allows college athletes to collectively bargain without them being employees. Notre Dame's former athletic director, Jack Swarbrick, raised that as a possibility in one of the many congressional hearings that has happened over the past few years, and other people have discussed that now as well. Maybe that's a possibility that'll happen. But again, as we already talked about, it's hard to get laws pushed through Congress. So,
and we do have a question from the audience, and folks, feel free to just toss those in there. I typically save them to the end, but just because we're on the topic, if you think that if athletes are deemed employees, do you think that things like room and board and scholarships are not taxable benefits?
If they're employees, will it be taxable?
Yeah.
I'm not a tax law expert, so I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that there are employees at universities already that get some, tuition benefits and things like that are not taxable. So it could be similar to that. But again, I'm not a tax expert, so I can't give a great answer on that question.
Well, maybe shifting gears here for a moment. I think we're starting to see, obviously, as the House Summit has kind of come and gone in some sense. At least kind of the wave of news has kind of ebbed back into some normalcy. You are starting to see more and more campuses trying to figure out how they position themselves and prepare themselves to kind of operationalize the rev sharing. And I think there's still a number of myriad of different questions that still need to be answered, but I think folks are starting to kind of try to get ahead of it so that they're not in the place where they were when, maybe a collective was late to their campus and they were 6 months behind everyone else. Like it feels like you're seeing more and more of this kind of, lean forward into getting ahead of it. Are there certain things that, you're seeing as watchouts or maybe best practices for some of these campuses that are in the process of doing that today?
Yeah, I would say there's really three big considerations. I would say number one, who's actually going to be contracting with and making payments to the athletes? Is that going to be the school directly, or is the school going to use a third party as its third party designee to make these payments to athletes? The House settlement docs do contemplate that some schools will use a third party designee that will be the entity actually contracting with the athletes and paying the athletes. And I think a lot of schools are leaning towards doing that, because that employment issue we talk about, if you're directly contracted with and paying your athletes, is that employment? They're not going to call it employment, but somebody might come in and say, this looks like employment to me. The IRS can say that, Department of Labor, court. And then also, some schools are leaning towards doing that for Title IX reasons,
Sure.
potentially. So I think that's a big one. Is the school going to directly contract and pay, or is a third party going to do it? Title IX is another one. We don't have any clarity on how Title IX applies to these
Right.
NIL compensation payments. We know that Title IX does apply, which I think most people already knew, but the Department of Education did come out and say, yes, Title IX does apply to these, but the important thing is how does it apply?
Right.
You ask some attorneys, they'll say it should be treated the way that athletic scholarship dollars are treated under Title IX, which says they need to be divided up proportionally to a school's general student body population. So if you have 51% female, 50% male general student body population, then
Yep.
50% of your dollars for scholarships supposed to go to females and 49 for males, with a variance of 1% either way. Some people say that's how the rev share NIL dollars need to be divided up. Other people say, and I tend to lean towards this second viewpoint, is that Title IX, the way the current regulations were written, they don't contemplate how NIL
Sure.
compensation payments should be paid out. At the time they were
Yeah.
written, which was many years ago, 30 years ago or so, there was no thought in anyone's head that schools would be directly compensating their athletes with NIL compensation. So it's going to have to be litigated to get a final answer
Right.
on what's right and what's wrong. But I think a lot more schools are now getting more comfortable with saying these are
Yeah.
market-based NIL payments. We're going to have to pay them, based on what these athletes' actual NIL value is, and we can't just artificially say 50% has to go to female, 50% to male. We're going to pay them out based on who's actually generating this revenue based on the value of their NIL. So in that case, more is going to probably go to football, basketball, men's and women's basketball, maybe a few other sports.
Sure.
So that's another
Yeah.
issue.
We've been seeing a lot of that third party kind of discussion going on right now. Obviously, we work with a bunch of collectives and agencies, and I think on more and more of those campuses, you're starting to hear, hey, operationalizing this stuff is not going to be insignificant in terms of cost and investment. And just the other one that it's funny, I was on a campus, a couple of days ago, like to even hear about them thinking through, hey, hiring a staff of 4, if the world is changing quickly and seems to never stop changing, like, if we hire 4 public employees at a public institution, and their state laws are particularly, a little bit more aggressive in terms of employment rights, like, hey, I can't fire those 4 people.
Right.
I can't, what am I going to do? Just have them sit there and spin their thumbs like in the corner of the room, just,
Right.
Waiting for the next 30 years to retire. Like,
Yeah.
whereas some of these third parties have a little bit more ability to kind of flex up and down. And obviously hiring 4 people is a huge capital requirement that has to go through, public approval processes and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I think, even just the staffing side of things, we've seen, having the ability to kind of flex some of that over into the third party has been particularly helpful for these folks that are thinking through it. But
yeah. And then there's also just general liability issues. If you're a school,
sure,
contracting with hundreds of athletes at your school to pay them NIL compensation, inevitably some of those contracts are going to, there's going to be conflict. An athlete thinks they're supposed to get paid more than the school paid them, and maybe litigation ends up. Would you rather kind of offload that liability to a third party and have them be the one that has to deal with it? Maybe in some cases. The third issue that I was going to talk about that I didn't bring up yet is what the athlete agreements are going to look like.
Sure.
Whether it's with the school directly or a third party. I think there's a lot of variation that can exist there. Like, some people are talking about it just being a straight license payment, and we're not going to require athletes to do anything. Some we're going to require them to do services, generally to like promote the school and its athletics teams, which I think is smart. You might as well, get something out of these payments to help promote the university. And it doesn't have to be super labor intensive or time intensive things for the athletes. They're honestly already engaging in a lot of these promotional activities that
These
like
guys are creating
video
content
content
for
stuff,
I
yeah,
was just gonna
can
say,
already
like
be
the in-game
used.
content
Yeah,
is they're already doing it.
right, exactly. Um, and then also, I've heard some schools talk about, are we going to do multi-year agreements? Are we going to include buyouts? Are we going to try and get exclusive rights to their NIL so we control all the deals they do? And if they want to transfer, then they're going to have to, pay us a buyout
Sure.
for that. And then, are there going to be bonus incentive payments in these contracts? I've heard some schools are thinking about, like, for a football player, we'll pay you more based on the number of snaps that you play. I don't know how you
Interesting.
differentiate between that being payment for athletic performance or payment for NIL. Maybe you could say their NIL value has increased because they
Yeah.
paid
Or all
more
the
on TV
right.
more.
Sure.
So all kinds of different
I'm
issues
sure there
with
will
the
be some
contracts.
lawyers out there that president company included that are gonna help to get creative with
Yeah.
things to help folks deal with it. Because the contracts are that I've seen at least are already starting to kind of walk down that path and prepare, I think, for a world in which, you know, this is going to probably be more related to whether or not you're putting the jersey on,
Mhm.
and staying on our campus than it is going to be, hey, we want you to do 10 social media posts over the next 10
Right.
months,
Yeah.
kind of stuff. But super interesting. 501c3. I know you work with a handful of folks that have 501c3 kind of collectives, but also more of these foundations are getting involved. You're starting to see point transfers. Hey, you give to the collective, you get points with the institution. The IRS came down whenever it was, probably like a little over a year ago now,
Yeah.
kind of saying like, hey, watch out, like be careful. um Nothing's really happened since then, to my knowledge, other than the IRS has approved a couple of collectives to be, 501c3s. Or at least like approve the initial applications for some of these. So, like in this kind of like shifting world, do you see anything kind of happening with the 501c3 model, or anything that folks need to be thinking about as this continues to evolve?
Yeah, I think generally most of the collectives that are 501c3s will probably stop operating over the next, I don't know, year or so. I say that because, number one, there's still some IRS risk there.
Sure.
They could start auditing collectives and
Yeah.
taking a their
Yeah,
status
I
and
don't
finding.
I don't want to say we've not seen anything, so that we'll never see anything, because
Yeah,
you don't want to be
yeah,
the one that
right,
that is. But
yeah. So there's still some IRS risk there, but then also when you're talking about a world where after the house settlement, schools can either directly pay or fund payments to their athletes. At that point, donors can just give to the school, and the school can then use that money to pay the athletes or fund the payments for the athletes, and the donor gets their tax deduction like they normally do for giving to the school. Donors aren't going to be giving money like for NIL; they'll be giving to athletics, and then athletics decides what's the best use of this money.
sure.
So I think because of that, a lot of the 501c3 collectives um, will likely shut down. I mean, you already saw Alabama
Yeah.
shut theirs down. There are some others I'm aware of that
Yeah.
are in the process of doing
Same.
it as well.
Yeah.
There might be some if you're talking about a place where this school already knows they're going to be hitting their rev share cap number, and they
Yep.
want to have the ability to get their athletes more for competitive recruiting purposes. And so there might be a 501c3 collective affiliated with that school that the school doesn't care if they stick around or wants them to stick around. So donors can give more money to them, and they can, get more
Sure.
NIL money to their athletes on top of what they're able to give them with their rev share cap. But I think generally you'll see a lot of them probably go away.
On the topic of cap management, you do an excellent job, probably better than anyone that we know, and our sales team thanks you for this. You're the guy that we go to every day to see who's hired a GM, who's
Yeah.
the new GM on the new campus. Like, that's clearly become of all the roles that I think people think they might need for kind of the future state of this. that's the one that people seem to be hiring for more than any at
Mhm.
this stage. And what do you see within that role, and where do you see that continuing to evolve into?
Yeah, I think there's a couple important things that these GMs are going to be doing. Number one, I think a lot of their focus is going to be on how much are we going to pay people on our roster. Because most schools are going to say, all right, football team, here's your budget. Remember that's
Sure.
10 million, say $10 million. All right, so like, how are we going to divide that $10 million up amongst our roster? Like, which positions are most valuable? Um, QB's valuable, edge rushers,
Sure.
line, stuff like that. So what are we going to basically slot for our QB and for these other positions? That'll be an important thing. And then obviously the transfer portal is very important. There's a ton of player movement right now. So keeping track of, who might be going into the portal next
Right.
year. All of that roster management stuff. I think those will be, the two really important things. How much are we going to pay our roster, and then what's our roster going to look like next year? Where do we have holes that we need to fill? Um, and it's interesting the people that schools are hiring or bringing in from the outside third party world to kind of do this
Yeah.
stuff. Some they're just kind of elevating someone who might already be on the coaching staff to do
Right.
this. Other places they're hiring people that worked in pro sports or bringing
Hmm.
in some consultants that used to be, assistant GMs for NFL teams.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think you're going to see like a wide variance of how schools approach this, but especially the P4 level, I think you're pretty much going to see, every school have someone that's serving those functions. At least they might not be called the GM, uh,
Right.
but
Well,
yeah,
it's college
that's going to be
athletics
really
to
important.
me is a really interesting one because, for the first time in history, you're going to have GMs deciding what the best, return on investment is across different teams. Like
Yeah,
every GM throughout history up until now, and maybe there's a couple of instances where I'm not telling the truth here, but like, hey, you have more dollars to spend on your football team. Optimize your football team. But if you come to an athletic department and say, hey, you have more money to spend, like, hey, you have an extra $400,000. Like, if I put that into football, do I just go from a 8-win team to a 8.5-win team? Like, does
mhm.
that actually give me a return versus if I park that 400 in my, women's soccer program, I go from being a middle of the pack, conference team to a playoff caliber team. Like, does
Yeah,
and that may not return it as well. Like it may make more sense to put it into football. It may make more sense to put it in men's, but like those are the kinds of puts and takes that I don't think anyone in the history of general manager and front office ship has like had to think about or like piece together.
yeah,
A cap across multiple different sports with multiple different kind of ROIs and profiles, and
yeah,
you know, it's really fascinating to see kind of
yeah,
how these schools are starting to already try to put the pieces together to manage that.
yeah. It's really two different levels of decision making. It's number one for each team with their
Yeah.
budget. How are they going to divide that up? But then above that, like you said, how much are we going to allot to each team,
Right.
and what's the best way? If we want to really win in baseball, how much do we need to allot for baseball
Right.
or for this other sport? So yeah, that'll be
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, and you've got these schools too that, hey, they're powerful programs, but they've got perennial, world class teams, like softball at Oklahoma, wrestling at Penn State, like they want to maintain and protect those
Yeah,
types of programs. Like that's North Carolina, like lacrosse and women's soccer and some of these other ones. It's just really interesting to see kind of how having one of those really really excellent programs is going to force you to make different decisions than you know the Georgias of the world. And no
yeah,
disrespect to any other Georgia team, I don't know if they may have a great growing team, but
yeah,
they certainly have a great football team.
yeah.
And
And I
how
think
you make those calls.
I think what you're describing is also one reason why NIL collectives are still going to stick
Sure.
around, because you're going to have a lot of teams that want a lot of money, and it's going to be hard to decide how much to give each team. And so inevitably there are going to be places where to be competitive in recruiting for certain teams, they're going to need more money, and that's going to have to come in from collectives to fill that. I know the House settlement has some provisions in it that's trying to make it pretty hard for collectives to operate the way they have been operating. We'll see how that goes, if that actually works or not. But collectives are still going to stick around and be a thing.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk about that for a moment, because I mean, hey, there's going to be a review panel, and there's going to be, like, to me, is this not just going to take the same shape and form that we saw when the NCAA said you can't do that, and attorney generals from states say, oh, yes, we can? Like, does the House settlement make that more difficult to do, or are we just going to run right back into the same kind of loop that we just came from?
It makes it more difficult for an athlete that's a class member to sue, to invalidate those types of rules. But if you're a third party, like a state attorney general, you can still bring lawsuits to challenge those types of things. And like we saw with the Tennessee Virginia case, the attorney generals challenged the NIL recruiting rules. Attorney generals are the ones that challenge the multi-time transfer rules, and won both of those cases. So you could have,
it's going to take an attorney general who wants to win over their state by helping their football team.
Yeah, which, I mean, it very likely could happen, because you might have some pretty angry, wealthy donors who give to a collective, and if the NCAA says, we don't think this deal is within fair market value, so you can't do it, and maybe that person goes to the attorney general and says, hey, you see what's going on over here? They're not letting us do these deals. They're not letting the free market operate. They're telling me what the fair market value is for this deal. How can they tell me what fair market value is?
I'm setting the market.
Yeah, it's whatever I want to pay him. That's the market. So
there'll
be some litigation around that part for sure.
Left or right, red or blue, the one thing we can all agree on is help our football team win.
Yeah, exactly.
That's like up there with church. Just, like, hey, great, we're all gonna pray to the football gods. What else? Any other kind of big ones that you're seeing out within the world of college athletics, and certainly as it relates to NIL, that maybe folks aren't quite as tuned into or focused on these days?
I mean, you still see some states passing state laws right now that kind of allow them to do things in this, I guess, interim period for House settlements approved and the rules actually change. So I think, you're seeing schools being able to get a lot closer with their collectives and enter into agreements with collectives, or maybe they're able to send money from the school to the collective and do these donor point things for donations to collectives. So I think in places where they're able to do that type of stuff because of the state law, they're probably going to have maybe a little bit of a head start on once the rules do change with the House settlement. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Are there any particulars of things for folks to be thinking about as they're talking to their local Congress folks?
I mean, there are a number of state laws that have been passed over the last year or so that are pretty good models, in my opinion. Illinois just passed one. It's a pretty good one. Mississippi had one that went into effect. Those are both pretty similar. So things in laws like that are pretty good models. I don't know if every state's different on what their legislative cycle looks like. I don't know if you still do have, like, I guess, a year or so until the House settlement terms are actually supposed to go into effect. So there could be a place where it would make sense to get a law passed, to kind of let some different things happen before those rules kick in.
Yeah. Dude, really appreciate the time. Truly can't thank you enough. I know we covered a lot of ground. Folks, if anyone has any other questions or anything from Mid, feel free to shoot them our way. And we'll certainly get them to you. But yeah, cannot recommend highly enough. If you're not following Mid, I catch a lot of his LinkedIn and Twitter stuff. He is, again, kind of on the cutting edge of this world and what's going on within it, particularly as you're getting into more of the legal side and what the future of this industry is going to look like. So they really appreciate you taking the time with us and giving us a couple of minutes to pick your brain and dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah. again, thanks for having me. Like you said, there's a lot of different issues to talk about. There's going to continue to be issues, so there'll be lots of other things for people to keep their eye on and continue to talk about and try and figure out. So should be a fun next few years.
Without question, at the very least, it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
All right, man. Really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much.
Yep. Thanks.
Yep.